Men suffer in silence. This is true, and we shouldn't interfere or give them a hard time about it. Showing emotions is still considered non-masculine in our society, especially difficult emotions. Today we take on the sensitive topic of men's suffering, stereotypes, and perhaps most importantly, the attempts to break them. So before we begin, I would like to ask one question that I'll try to answer. Is the way that men stereotypically experience suffering wrong? Before I share with you two strategies that men usually adopt in their suffering, I want to tell you about an interesting study from 2017 that identified different types of silence. Chris Bowden of the University of Victoria in Wellington studied young New Zealanders between the ages of 17 and 25 years old who had experienced the suicide of a very close friend. And although in most situations this type of suffering is dealt with in the 5 classic stages of mourning, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, the findings of this study described a very significant aspect of silence. Exactly 4 kinds of silence. Personal silence, an attempt to distract and redirect thoughts to something else, avoiding thinking about the troubling topic in the belief that it'll heal by itself. Private silence, under pressure that results from the upbringing and is based on the subconscious rejection of emotions. It differs from personal silence in that it happens, as it were, against the will of the sufferer. Public silence, resulting from the pressure of the society when any other reaction would not be accepted. And analytical silence, closely related to the reflective strategy that I'll talk about later. So as you can see, there are various ways to be silent, and they're not necessarily evil. But let's start from the beginning and answer the key question. Why do men suffer in silence? It turns out that what's mostly responsible for this silence is our culture and social expectations, much less the male nature itself. This cultural and pedagogical code passed down in societies manifests itself on 2 levels: in conscious upbringing and unconscious social pressure. Let's start with the masculine stereotype, which there is a lot wrong with. In crisis situations, stereotypically, men are expected to act a certain way, show emotional reserve and stoicism, hold back expressions, maintain control, be pragmatic and action-oriented. When you reflect on the above phrases for a moment and think about their opposites, you'll quickly discover how society judges those attitudes. Emotional edginess, dramatic expression and exalted suffering, losing control over emotions and the situation, depressed attitude, all this brings up an image of a stereotypical hysterical woman. Unfortunately, such is the case with the expressive stereotypes that often the negatively implied ones are attributed to women, which just proves how very bad stereotypes are in general. Only this stereotype is a fallacy. It's a very narrow view where we have a manly man for whom the only alternative to such silent suppression of emotions is a kind of feminization of his suffering. This attitude wrongly presumes that there is only one way to experience suffering properly, and it is being extremely expressive and effusive. Let's get our ducks in a row. We have very little gender-segregated research material on how people go through suffering and on the effectiveness of these methods. Research does not unequivocally show that the way men experience suffering in silence is somehow worse than the way women stereotypically experience the same. This may seem counterintuitive, as it is widely assumed that stifling emotions and burying them can quickly lead to psychosomatic disorders. It is assumed that more effective strategies in case of suffering are to talk it out, cry it out, understand what happened, get therapy if needed. It turns out that this is not really the case, at least not with suffering, which must be clearly distinguished from trauma. They are somewhat different things. So what strategies do men adopt? There are 2: strategy of diversion and strategy of reflection. Diversion is one of the common strategies that on the surface may seem worse because it deliberately shifts the attention away from the heart of the problem, from thinking about it. But this can be directed, and many men engulf themselves in very hard work to drown out their inner anxiety, to prove something. Diversion, however, can also end up badly when a man distracts himself from suffering with stimulants or acts in a way that is harmful to himself. This stereotype is actually deeply rooted in our culture. Just think about the last few movies you saw and think about what happened when a guy was down, something went wrong, he experienced a failure or someone died. What did the real guys do? Hit the bar, a glass of whiskey or a beer. The strategy of diversion, that is, masking anxiety with other activities, can be surprisingly powerful. In a slightly different context, this strategy turns out to be an unusual driving force. In a report by the Clergy Project, we read that the strategy of diversion is responsible for a lot of good being done in the name of many religions. What is the inference? The Clergy Project is a non-profit organization from the United States that provides spiritual support to clergymen who have become non-believers after 10, 20, or even 40 years of religious service, who not only lack many specific skills needed in the job market, but their departure from faith usually results in being ostracized by their communities and their families. This organization helps them find themselves in their new life. One of the first reports that followed several hundred interventions described that one of the most characteristic behaviors of a doubting or even unbelieving clergyman living in a deep state of repression is his involvement in very complex social aid projects. It is an interesting dependence because the more anxiety and uncertainty a given clergyman felt, the more willingly and actively he engaged or initiated social projects on a very large scale. What I want to show you is that the strategy of diversion, distracting one's attention from the problem and denial of suffering, is very powerful and shouldn't be degraded. What can we learn from this strategy? If a man suffers but feels a strong urge to act, let him act. Don't interrupt him. Don't distract him. This is his primary mechanism for dealing with pain. Diversion turns to problem solving. By solving problems, a man can often build his self-esteem. So, if he suffers, he will counter his suffering with his perceived self-worth, put it to the test, and if it works out, he will emerge triumphant. Very often, only after this stage will the man be ready to open up to other strategies for coping with his suffering. In professional terminology, the diversion strategy is sometimes called objectifying the suffering. In contrast to diversion, the reflection strategy may be considered to be closer to a typically female strategy, as it focuses strongly on understanding and accepting the situation that causes the suffering. In professional terminology, the term intuitive suffering is also used. In men, it means that, to some extent, they have to surrender to these strong emotions and let them go. However, it often manifests itself as a need to talk, complain, and listen to some stories. The key word here is listen, and most often listen in silence. For people who have never practiced active listening, listening in silence can be unusual and surprising. So if you feel the urge to ask, "Why are you silent? Why aren't you saying anything?" and you think the guy is somehow behaving strangely, it may just mean that he's using the reflection strategy, even if he doesn't fully understand it himself. Both of these strategies, reflection and diversion, are often implemented unconsciously, intuitively. Both achieve meaningful results. If we guys are already using one of these strategies, there is no point in forcing us to try other solutions. Many of these intuitive strategies lead directly to the healing of wounds and the acceptance of the new reality. Not every guy needs to let out emotions. It's not always the best solution. It's a stereotype that you have to let a guy cry, give him space. Healing will only take place where the sufferer feels comfortable. And in therapy, he may feel 20 times worse, so you really need to be able to distinguish between trauma and suffering. I hope I was able to shed some light on the delicate topic of men's suffering and why we shouldn't bother them so often when they're going through it. Thank you for your attention, and remember, be extraordinary.